All right. So there's been a slew of elections this year. I think it's a record year for elections, and a lot of conversations about the rise of the right, the failure of the left, and we've seen recent elections where the left seems to be making somewhat of a comeback in Europe. But there's a lot to delve into, especially when you look at our municipal, provincial, and federal politics, what's going on in the U.S. as well. So I'm trying a little experiment here and trying to have a more of an in-depth conversation on certain topics while I'm filling in for Elias on the show this summer. And so I'm really interested about the issue of why progressive or left-leaning governments, whatever you want to call them, seem to be failing here. And how do you juxtapose that to what we've seen in Europe last week, in the UK and in France? So I turned to some Big Five regulars to help me out. In studio, I have strategic consultant and former city councillor Justine McIntyre. Thank you, Justine, for joining us.
My pleasure.
And for playing our little game this morning. And on the phone, I have political analyst Anne Lagace-Dowson. And thank you so much for trying this out this morning.
I think it's an interesting subject. I commend you.
So, but it's just like on the Big Five, we basically have everybody. I'm also a panelist on the Big Five, so I know how it is from both sides. I mean, we basically have a minute and a half at best to comment the day's events, and on this one, there's a lot of different layers, I think, and you both have thought on these issues at length from your experience, your perspective. So, I guess what I'll start off with is, up until, say, Thursday, my topic would have been the left is basically in decline everywhere. And then the voters in the UK proved me wrong because they voted out the Conservatives after a 14-year reign and voted in the Labour Party. And it seemed like France was headed towards a massive shift to the far right, or the extreme right, whatever you want to call it. And because of, massive strategies by both the centrist bloc and the left bloc, they blocked it. They blocked the far right from getting there, and it advantaged the most the far left in France. Now, they're far from a majority government, but they are the biggest bloc, followed closely by the center Macronist bloc, and then the far right is still there, and still record numbers for the far right. You've never seen the far right in France get 130 seats in the 577-seat National Assembly. But when you look here in Montreal, I mean, the Plante administration is struggling. If you any poll will show that the Plante administration is struggling. Provincially, Quebec Solidaire is struggling. All the polls, the recent strife, turmoil over there shows it. The Liberal Party of Quebec, which used to have a center-left slant along with center-rights, let's face it, it's a centrist party, but they're nowhere to be seen. It's right-wing forces. I mean, either the CQ and the PQ has shifted clearly to the right under Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon. Federally, I mean, what do I need to say about the Trudeau government, the NDP? I mean, I remember, Anne, we were talking about the results in Toronto-St. Paul last week, and you mentioned even how the NDP wasn't even close to being a factor in that by-election. It doesn't seem like the NDP will be a factor in the next federal election. So, I could add the U.S. In the U.S., you have a booming economy. The Biden administration, by all metrics, is a success. And even before the age question for Biden, even before the debate debacle, I mean, Trump was running neck and neck with the Biden administration. And the right-wing forces there are clearly on the rise. And if election were held tomorrow, Trump will be president of the United States. So, long premise, but we're doing two segments here. But I guess my first questions to both of you, and I'll start with you, Anne, is what is wrong with progressive politics?
I think the situation that we find ourselves in makes it difficult for a dissenting voice because the center-right parties side with the establishment. Like when, Pierre Poilievre gets up and tackles, talks about common sense and talks about workers, he's really not honest. In fact, I think he's flat out lying. This is a guy who meets with lobbyists all the time, etc. So it's confusing to a lot of people. A lot of people have turned away from electoral politics. Mm-hmm. Like the numbers of people who just don't vote is really high. Sure. And I think there's a feeling of abandonment and a decline in trust. Those who have resources are okay. They tend to vote. And those who don't can't break through and have just sort of thrown up their hands. And that's because I think we've seen a broken social contract. We see the 99%, I guess you could say, struggling and suffering, rising inequality, younger people rejecting incumbents, feeling powerless and feeling a feeling of grievance, I think. So the left hasn't been very good or hasn't been good enough at channeling that in a political way. I think to the credit of the NDP, they signed an agreement with the Liberals. They brought in dental care, which is widening out right now. They've done a bunch of really interesting things at the federal level with relatively little leverage. So they've shown some creativity. So I wouldn't write them off, nor would I write off the Liberals at this point, even though Justin Trudeau's numbers have dropped by a huge number. So it's a difficult period. It's a similar period to the 1930s in some ways, right? Mm-hmm. In the 1930s, we saw the rise of the right after an economic crash, after the elites just took off with all the money and plundered the markets for themselves. So it's a real challenge, but I don't think you can underestimate left populism. We've seen right populism, but there is such a thing as left populism. Sure. And I think it's there. And I think we saw a bit of it in France. We saw it in India, where Narendra Modi got a big pushback from more moderate and left elements of the society. Even in Iran, we're seeing a moderate, more democratic leader. So I wouldn't be too hasty about writing off the possibility of left populism and opposition to these authoritarian regimes.
David Heurtel with you, continuing my in-depth conversation with Anne Lagace-Dowson and Justine McIntyre. The question today is how to explain the perceived decline of the left in our politics. So we heard about from Anne before the break. Justine, when you look at the polling, people feel that these progressive governments are disconnected. They cater to special interests. If you look at Justin Trudeau, I don't want to make it specifically about one government, but you can take whatever examples you want. But it seems, generally speaking, that there is a disconnect between progressive politics and, say, maybe what you would call the silent majority.
I like that you bring up the silent majority, because that is something that I think about often, and I think that we don't address enough. In fact, when you first pitched me on coming in to talk about this on the show, initially I think we were going to talk about the collapse of the left. Yes, because we were looking at what was going on in France, and everybody expected that the left was going to collapse. Yeah. And what we've seen instead, I think, is a collapse of the center, which we're seeing here as well. I think that governments find it more and more difficult to hold the center line. The center line requires rallying people who don't agree, requires going towards positions that are distant from one another and trying to bring them at least closer together so that they can cohabitate. And I think one of the reasons why we're seeing the collapse of the center is that we're increasingly in a very individualistic society, and people are no longer willing to make those kinds of compromises. Also, the rate of change has accelerated. So the rate of change in terms of what we've just gone through with COVID, what we're being expected to do in terms of adaptation to climate change, and also climate change happening faster than it was predicted. And people are starting to feel like they've been jostled, and that somewhere they've been maybe a little bit ripped off, that rather than fulfilling its promise of taking care of things and allowing people to live our independent lives, our family lives in a happy and basically peaceful way. Instead, we're suddenly being confronted with extreme climate, with wars, with viruses that are becoming pandemics. So there is a breach of the social contract that's happening, and the left has not been able to respond to that, mostly because they've been caught up with infighting, they've been caught up with identity issues, they've been caught up with obsession over having a sort of doctrine of virtue, that if you don't conform to that doctrine of virtue, are you part of the left or are you not part of the left? So there's been a lot of that inner turmoil, which means that the left that used to be the group that best represented common interests no longer does that effectively, and the right has latched onto that, and that's where we've seen those very populist movements gaining ground. And we see it in Poilievre's speech. We see his oversimplification of issues, like we can see when we look at Europe as well. And that's appealing to a part of the population that is feeling like the bottom has dropped out, change has happened at a pace that they're not able to keep up with, and the government's not there to support them.
And I want you to react to what Justine said. I would add also, you look at the whole discourse on immigration having evolved. I mean, 10 years ago, all the polls would show a massive support for immigration. Now that issue is a net negative in Canada and in Quebec. I really liked your reference to history in the 30s. We are after a major pandemic, economic upheaval, war, migrant crises around the world. I mean, there's a lot going on here, but it seems that the populist discourse of the right is connecting, and it seems that the left is not being able to respond in any coherent or concrete way.
So the populism, I think you can sort of loosely define as being a discourse against a corrupt elite. In general, right? So the left and the right can, use that discourse that there's a corrupt elite, which is, two-faced on the part of the right, I would argue, for the most part. But anyway, there's a corrupt elite. That's first criteria. Second criteria is we need more people power. We need more democracy. We need the people to be heard. And the right wing interprets that mostly to mean we need white male people to be heard, because I think a lot of the motivation behind some of these authoritarian regimes and this rightward shift is a backlash against progress made by the left. Groups like LGBTQ people, racialized people, they have made progress socially, and some people don't like that and they're afraid of it. But that hasn't really taken hold to the same degree in Canada as it has elsewhere, because Canada is 23% immigrant, right? 23% of our population has been landed or permanent, residents. So it doesn't work as well here, although progress is being made by that right-wing discourse even here. So, and then if you add to that disinformation, misinformation, flat-out lying about vaccines, about the World Economic Forum, about LGBTQ people, and the threat of drag queens, perceived threat, that really scares people and is whipped up in a very dishonest fashion for the benefit of certain electoral and, political interests. So, I think there is such a thing as left populism. We've seen it in the past when Tommy Douglas introduced healthcare in Saskatchewan. He did that on a wave of support by the labor movement and decades of campaigning. And then it spread across the country with a collaborative agreement between the Liberals and the NDP against huge opposition by doctors, among other things. I don't even think people remember in 1970, when Quebec finally signed on, the last province to sign on to healthcare, all of the specialists went out on strike. And they were forced back to work because the War Measures Act was invoked. So just a little view.
Sure.
If you take a historical...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Take a historical view, I'm just going to say, this is not new, and we need to be, careful and vigilant. Like, you need to be sure that you vote, because voting does matter, and people not voting opens up a space that's very unfortunate, because the vast majority of Quebecers and Canadians vote to the center and left. Just factual number.
No, and I appreciate the historical references, Anne, and I'm not disputing. I'm not saying that the left will disappear forever. There have been their populist waves in the past, but right now, the numbers show clearly the left is not gaining a lot of popular favor. I mean, when I was in government, the vast majority of all provincial governments, plus Ottawa, were center-left, Liberal, or NDP governments. Now, the majority of Canada, provincially, majority are Conservative governments. There are two NDP
Seven.
governments and one Liberal government, Manitoba, BC,
and seven Conservative ones.
Yeah, that's it. So there's definitely something going on. And if a federal election were held tomorrow, I mean, the Liberals would have maybe less than 100 seats. I mean, so, and the NDP would not benefit from this either. So there's definitely something. I want to latch on, and Justine, about being heard. I get the sense that, and of course, this is a horrible generalization, but right, there are a lot of special interest groups that feel catered to by progressive governments, but there is, in the U.S., the right is catering to white, male, female, uneducated, and in a lot of areas that's working very well because for years now, a lot of these swaths of population don't feel heard by governments.
Mm-hmm. That's been what a lot of the leftist discourse has been about for the past decade or so, is about making room for voices of the unheard and so on. And that's laudable. But unfortunately, the backlash or the downside of that is making everybody else feel like there's no longer room for them. They're no longer an electorate that's interesting to speak to. And so there's a whole swath of the electorate, that simply feels abandoned. So, Anne, you brought up earlier that there are people that feel scared or threatened by some of the issues that are being pushed by the left. And in my opinion, just from my observation, I don't think people are scared or threatened. I think that they simply feel that they are no longer being heard. I think that they feel that the window has shifted so far to the left that we're focusing so much on issues of identity and individual rights that we've lost the bigger picture of where are we going as a society? Where are our traditional values? How do we define those? How do we move forward together as a country? And that's where the right is able to come in and pick up so much steam and so much energy because they have never swayed from their message. They are very much on point. They know exactly who they're talking to. And unfortunately, again, like both sides can play the negative game as well and draw on the negative groups within, like the negative subgroups within their electorate. And that's what I think is the biggest threat when we talk about the collapse of the center, is our inability to really rally people around a common ideal.
That's all the time I have. I really appreciate both of you for joining my little experiment this morning to try to go in depth on one specific topic from the news. Anne Lagace-Dowson, Justine McIntyre, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. That
David.
Was fun. I think we'll try that again. I think we can continue the conversation for sure.